So today we're beginning our analysis of the materials you've shared with us. And the figure at the center of this exploration is, of course, Ronald Wilson Reagan, the 40th president in the United States.
That's right.
His life story is, it's truly unique in American politics. You have this massive narrative arc that goes from a popular Hollywood actor, a television host, all the way to becoming the defining icon of modern American conservatism. His presidency really, more than maybe any other in the late 20th century, set a new blueprint that everyone who came after, regardless of party, had to deal with.
That is the perfect starting point. The documents and articles we've synthesized for you give a complete chronological look at his entire path.
The whole thing.
The whole thing. We're going back to his beginnings in Tampico, Illinois, tracing his very unexpected career in show business, his 8 years as governor of California, and then, of course, his 2 transformative terms in the White House.
So the goal here is to offer a really clear synthesis of the most important moments.
Exactly. We're focusing particularly on the seismic and often really surprising shifts in his career path and the contradictory elements you find in his biggest policies.
Our mission here is to pull out the crucial insights from all this material, to give you a shortcut to understanding the key economic, the social, and the foreign policy decisions that really defined the 1980s and, changed America's direction.
Right. And this isn't just a summary.
No.
We want to get to the why and the how of what's called the Reagan Revolution.
Yeah.
To do that, we've laid out a clear path. First, we'll start with his unexpected beginnings in show business and his early political life.
The character formation.
Yes, exactly. Then we'll move to how he really forged his conservative political identity, looking at the contradictions of his time as governor. And finally, we'll spend the most time dissecting the major challenges and the crises of his presidency, and then end with a look at his complex historical reputation.
Okay, let's unpack this incredible journey, starting with the very modest and in many ways challenging origins of Ronald Reagan's life. He was born in Tampico, Illinois, February 6, 1911.
And his upbringing was really characterized by this powerful duality, defined largely by his parents.
His mother, Nell Wilson Reagan, seems to have been the most central and stable influence.
She was a devout member of the Disciples of Christ, and she imparted the principles of the social gospel. And for anyone listening who isn't familiar, the social gospel was a Protestant movement that applied Christian ethics to social problems.
It emphasized that salvation wasn't just about personal piety.
No, it was tied to active involvement in social justice, in charity, in public service. This focus on the common good, on community, it really remained a thread throughout his life, even as his politics changed so dramatically.
And then on the other side of that, you have his father, John Jack Reagan, a shoe salesman.
Yes, and the sources emphasize that Jack was ambitious, hardworking, but his ambition was severely complicated by his ongoing struggle with alcoholism.
That exposure to the chaos, the unpredictability of his father's addiction, it seems to have shaped Reagan very deeply.
It fostered a need for order and stability that you can absolutely see later in his political temperament.
So moving on to his education, he attended Eureka College and graduated in 1932, B.A. in economics and sociology.
And he wasn't described as a particularly brilliant student. The sources repeatedly say he was, admittedly mediocre in his academic subjects.
But he thrived in campus politics.
Absolutely thrived. His talents lay not in solitary study, but in public communication and organizing, even from an early age.
And he demonstrated that skill very quickly. Just as he started college, the institution was planning cuts because of the Great Depression.
And Reagan led a student strike. He gave this impassioned speech that galvanized his peers, and the result was the college president was forced to resign.
It's a remarkable incident. It shows very early on his ability to rally people and challenge the established order.
And we also see early evidence that his mother's teachings translated into a progressive social conscience. There's a memorable detail in the materials.
Of football teammates.
Exactly. 2 of his black football teammates were refused service at a segregated hotel. Reagan's response was immediate. He didn't just complain, he invited them back to his parents' home.
And his parents welcomed them.
Immediately. Served them dinner. It's a small, personal act, but it illustrates an early anti-racism stance that was quite progressive for the rural Midwest in the 1930s.
This political skill was put on hold after graduation, which leads to his truly surprising first career. His first professional job was as a sports broadcaster for WHO Radio in Des Moines, Iowa.
And this wasn't just reading scores. The materials detail this remarkably inventive process he had.
Right, he became known for creating what sounded like live, dynamic, play-by-play accounts of Chicago Cubs baseball games.
But the catch was, he was doing this from a studio in Iowa, using only basic wire descriptions that came in over a telegraph ticker.
So he's essentially narrating imaginary action.
He is, relying on his descriptive flair and timing to make listeners believe he was right there, watching the game. It was a spectacular early lesson in narrative control and communication.
It certainly was, and that training, that quick thinking, it was invaluable. In 1937, while traveling with the Cubs for spring training, he took a screen test and landed a 7-year contract with Warner Bros.
He was quickly typecast, mostly in B films. But he did achieve a true breakout success, playing the football legend George Gipp in Newt Rockne All-American in 1940.
A role that was so significant it earned him the permanent nickname, the Gipper.
A powerful symbol of fighting spirit that his political strategist would revive decades later.
And his best-received performance, according to many critics, was as a leg amputee in the 1942 drama King's Row. It's a powerful performance, but his movie stardom really did wane after World War II.
He made 53 films in total, but never quite regained that early celebrity height. His military service during the war is also crucial for understanding his later views.
He'd enlisted in the Army Reserve in 1937 and was called to active duty in 1942, but due to severe nearsightedness, he was deemed unfit for frontline combat.
Right. Instead, he was assigned to the Army Air Forces as a public relations officer.
And his job was incredibly prolific. He produced over 400 training films, but it was during this time, dealing with the military machine, that he grew intensely frustrated.
He saw what he perceived as the delays and inefficiencies of federal bureaucracy, and that feeling really crystallized his anti-government views years before he ever ran for office.
That experience led almost directly into union leadership, a truly pivotal role that put him at the center of the industry's political battles.
He was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG, for 2 separate periods. 1947 to 52, and again from 59 to 60.
And his first tenure was marked by these intense labor management disputes, right as the Cold War and anti-communist fever were rising.
He took a strong stance during a jurisdictional strike, siding with the established studios against a more radical union, the Conference of Studio Unions.
And that positioning was very consequential.
It was. Critics at the time argued that by siding with the studios, Reagan's leadership effectively insulated liberals within SAG by allowing them to be seen as moral innocents instead of scabs, which consolidated the power structure within the guild.
And his involvement in the Hollywood blacklist era is a documented fact. The FBI interviewed him, and he provided the names of individuals he suspected of having communist sympathies.
He also testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, asserting that some guild members were associated with the Communist Party. It was a decision that really cemented his anti-communist credentials.
Now, his second tenure as SAG president was focused more on economics. This time, he was fighting for better compensation, particularly for residual payments.
Right, royalties for the reuse of films on television. This was a bitter negotiation. But the final settlement secured a major victory, long-term financial stability for many actors by mandating pensions and paying residuals for films made after 1959.
It showed his effectiveness as a negotiator.
It did. And on a more personal note, we should mention his marriages. He married actress Jane Wyman in 1940. Their divorce in 1949 was influenced, as the sources state, by her lack of interest in his deepening political activities.
And he later met Nancy Davis when she reached out to him as SAG president. Her name had mistakenly appeared on a communist blacklist, and she sought his help.
They married in 1952, beginning one of the most famous political partnerships in American history.
That sets the perfect stage for the great political transformation. And it's essential to stress that the common narrative of Reagan as a lifelong conservative, it just doesn't hold up.
Not at all. He started firmly on the Democratic side. He often spoke of Franklin D. Roosevelt as a true hero and considered himself a New Deal Democrat.
He was active in liberal organizations in Hollywood and worked with the AFL-CIO against anti-union laws.
To show his commitment, there's an incredible anecdote from 1946. He appeared in a radio program called Operation Terror to speak out against rising Ku Klux Klan activity.
In that broadcast, he called the Klan a systematic campaign of fascist violence and intimidation and horror. I mean, very strong words.
And no doubt about his firm anti-extremist stance. He even supported Harry Truman in '48. The slow, methodical shift really began in the 1950s.
He started supporting Republicans, first Eisenhower in 52, then Nixon in 60, and this ideological move gained a lot of momentum when he began hosting General Electric Theater in 1954.
That job was crucial. As part of his contract, he traveled the country as a motivational speaker for GE. He'd give these speeches to employees at hundreds of plants, and slowly they became less about business motivation and more about free market principles and government overreach.
And this is where the ideological shift gets really stark. In those speeches, he controversially described Medicare as potentially marking the end of individual freedom in the United States.
He argued it was a step toward government socialism. This rhetoric placed him directly against the emerging liberal consensus of the time.
He formally switched to the Republican Party in 1962, but the moment that truly launched his national political career was a speech he gave 2 years later for Barry Goldwater's struggling presidential campaign.
That speech, delivered on national television, was titled A Time for Choosing. It was arguably one of the most successful political debuts in modern history.
It instantly profiled him as this powerful, articulate, new conservative voice.
The speech was a powerful indictment of excessive government regulation. He famously stated that the Founding Fathers understood that governments don't control things. The impact was immediate.
It raised millions of dollars for Goldwater, and even though Goldwater lost in a landslide, political observers called it the most successful national political debut since William Jennings Bryan.
It cemented Reagan's position as the heir apparent to the new conservative movement. This national profile led immediately to an appeal for him to run for governor of California in 1966.
He ran as a political outsider, leveraging his celebrity status against the incumbent, Pat Brown.
But when he won, his governorship immediately presented a key contradiction to his campaign rhetoric. He'd run as an anti-tax small government crusader, but he inherited a massive deficit from Brown that required immediate, painful action.
And this is a point that often trips up the simple narrative.
It does. To balance the budget, Reagan worked with the Democratic-controlled legislature and signed what was, at the time, the biggest tax hike in California's history.
It was a huge tax package on sales, banks, corporate profits, liquor, cigarettes.
It prompted intense criticism from the burgeoning conservative movement. They accused him of betraying his core principles.
So how did he justify it? I mean, given his anti-tax platform.
He argued that immediate fiscal responsibility, balancing the budget, was a prerequisite for restoring true financial health, which would then allow for future tax cuts.
And he did eventually achieve a surplus.
By 1973, yes. He achieved a surplus, which allowed him to return some money to taxpayers, thereby salvaging his conservative credibility, if somewhat dented.
His tenure also saw major social policy decisions, especially two significant acts from 1967. First, he signed the Mulford Act,
which prohibited the public carrying of loaded firearms in incorporated areas. It was California's most restrictive gun control legislation at the time.
And the sources confirm it was enacted almost entirely in direct response to the Black Panther Party's practice of cop-watching while openly and legally carrying weapons.
It shows a very pragmatic and contradictory use of government power to achieve a specific law and order objective.
Second, he signed the Therapeutic Abortion Act. It allowed abortions in cases of rape and incest, but it also included a mental health provision.
He later stated profound regret over signing this. He believed doctors interpreted the mental health clause too loosely, leading to a much higher number of abortions than he had ever intended.
And that later regret became a defining feature of his alignment with the pro-life movement.
He also became known for his hardline response to student unrest. The most famous example was in 1969 following massive protests at UC Berkeley, specifically around the site known as People's Park.
He declared a state of emergency and took severe action. He deployed the National Guard to occupy Berkeley for 17 days.
And his defense of these policies was unambiguous. In a now infamous statement in 1970, he said, "If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement."
That firmly established his image as the essential law and order conservative figure nationally.
After 2 terms, he declined to run for a third, immediately setting his sights on the presidency. His first attempt came quickly, challenging the sitting Republican president, Gerald Ford, in the 1976 primaries.
So why challenge a sitting president from his own party?
Ford was viewed by Reagan and many emerging conservatives as too moderate, especially on foreign policy. Reagan intensely criticized Ford's policy of détente with the Soviet Union.
which for our listeners was a period of easing strained relations built on cooperation rather than confrontation.
And Reagan believed this was a sign of weakness and complacency.
During that 76 campaign, he began to popularize the welfare queen narrative.
He did. He repeatedly exaggerated the case of Linda Taylor, an individual who had successfully misused welfare benefits.
The narrative was powerfully constructed to ignite voter resentment against social programs, particularly among white working-class voters. But he never explicitly named her or mentioned her race in his speeches.
The message, though, was clear. Government social programs were being exploited by the undeserving.
His challenge to Ford went all the way to the Republican National Convention, where Ford narrowly won the nomination. But the sources highlight a pivotal moment.
Right. Ford invited Reagan to address the convention, and Reagan gave this incredibly eloquent, unscripted concession speech that was so powerful it actually overshadowed Ford's own acceptance address.
Delegates reportedly left wondering if they'd nominated the wrong man.
4 years later, the national context was perfectly primed for Reagan's message. The 1980 election took place against a backdrop of severe issues: the Iran hostage crisis, crippling stagflation,
High inflation and high unemployment at the same time.
and high interest rates under President Jimmy Carter. Reagan's campaign was laser-focused on three principles: massive tax cuts, a reduction in the size of government, and a dramatic strengthening of the national defense.
Heading into the primaries, his age, he was almost 70, was a persistent issue. After a loss to George H.W. Bush in Iowa, the New Hampshire debate became the crucial turning point.
When the debate moderator tried to interrupt Reagan, he instinctively pushed back with his furious, unscripted retort.
"I'm paying for this microphone, Mr. Green's sick."
That spontaneous display of force was a massive public victory. It cast him as a man who wasn't afraid to stand up to the establishment. A perfect, authentic moment.
Before the general election, we have to address the long-standing debate over his speech at the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi in August 1980.
A very sensitive issue. He spoke there near the site of the 1964 murders of 3 civil rights workers, and he declared his belief in states' rights.
This sparked a debate that continues. Some view the visit and the rhetoric as a deliberate extension of the Southern strategy, designed to appeal to racial animus.
While allies and supporters maintain it was simply his standard anti-big government rhetoric, devoid of any intentional racial context.
Regardless of his original intent, what do the sources say was the long-term political impact?
The impact was substantial. That visit solidified the perception among many Southern white voters that Reagan was on their side regarding federal oversight. It helped cement the South's shift toward the Republican Party, which was crucial for his landslide victory.
His momentum carried through the general election debate, where his calm response to Carter, there you go again, resonated deeply with viewers.
On November 4, 1980, Reagan won in a massive landslide, 489 electoral votes. And crucially, Republicans also took the Senate for the first time since 1952, signaling a true political realignment.
This brings us directly into his presidency, starting with the first term and the major domestic realignment he began. He's inaugurated on January 20th, 1981, and his inaugural address set a tone of radical change.
He stated forcefully, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." A declaration of war on the New Deal consensus.
And in a moment of dramatic symbolism, Iran waited until he had been sworn in before announcing the release of the American hostages.
It ended the 444-day crisis. It was seen as a final insult to Carter, and it gave Reagan an immediate, though symbolic, foreign policy victory on day one.
But the presidency faced an existential threat just 70 days later, and we must acknowledge the severity of the crisis on March 30th, 1981, when Reagan was shot by John Hinckley Jr.
It was a moment of true national panic. He was described as being right on the margin of death, with a punctured lung and severe internal bleeding.
The speed of his recovery was remarkable, and his composure and humor during the crisis, famously joking with surgeons, were instantly mythologized.
He later attributed his survival to a belief that God had spared his life for a chosen mission. This near-death experience gave him an immense surge of political capital, which he immediately leveraged to pursue his economic agenda, Reaganomics.
Okay, so Reaganomics was a package of policies rooted in laissez-faire principles, supply-side economics, and monetarism. Let's break down supply-side economics. We often hear the critique trickle down, but what was the theory supposed to achieve?
Well, supply-side theory posits that if you lower marginal tax rates, especially on corporations and the wealthy, it increases their incentive to invest and produce.
The idea being that increased production, the supply, stimulates the whole economy.
Right. It leads to job creation and, crucially, generates enough new economic activity that the overall tax revenue base eventually increases, theoretically making up for the initial tax cuts. Growth comes from encouraging producers, not stimulating demand.
And monetarism, how did that factor in?
Monetarism focuses on controlling the money supply to manage inflation, which is the primary economic threat at the time. Reagan's administration supported Fed Chairman Paul Volcker's aggressively tight money policy.
Raising interest rates dramatically.
Nearly 20% sometimes. It was painful, it triggered a deep recession, but it was essential to the long-term plan.
The policy began with the Economic Recovery Tax Act in August '81, which dramatically lowered federal income tax rates.
But fiscal reality quickly collided with that promise. Less than a year later, he was forced to reverse course. He signed the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982, which doubled the federal cigarette tax and rescinded some corporate cuts.
And this moment is critical because the sources confirm that despite his anti-tax reputation, Reagan ultimately raised taxes 11 times during his 2 terms.
He did. Now, that tight money policy meant the economy immediately plunged into a deep recession. Unemployment peaked at a painful 10.8% in December 1982.
A massive political liability.
But the policy worked. Volcker's policy successfully curbed inflation, dropping it from 12% to under 5% by 1989. And when the economy turned around in '83, it sparked what was then the longest peacetime economic expansion in U.S. history.
However, the sources note that this expansion came with significant costs, particularly regarding equity.
The economic gains were not shared equally. It resulted in a demonstrable increase in economic inequality and a visible rise in homelessness.
Beyond taxes, economic deregulation was another major pillar. By 1986, the administration had eliminated nearly half of the federal regulations that existed in 1981.
And while some of that was seen as positive, the sources point to one catastrophic failure: the deregulation of savings and loan associations through the Garn-St. Germain Act of 1982.
This allowed S&Ls to engage in far riskier activities.
That lack of oversight led directly to widespread risky loans and mismanagement, contributing to the massive savings and loan crisis. The resulting taxpayer-funded bailouts would cost hundreds of billions of dollars.
And we can't discuss his economic policies without addressing the national debt. Due to a combination of major tax cuts and a massive defense buildup, the federal budget deficits soared.
The national debt nearly tripled, rising from 33% of GDP to 53%. And the sources explicitly state that Reagan himself later called this triple debt the greatest disappointment of his presidency.
Beyond economics, Reagan fundamentally altered the relationship between the presidency and organized labor. The defining moment was the PAT-TC strike in August 1981.
The Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization went on strike, but as federal employees, they were violating federal law. Reagan gave them an ultimatum: return to work in 48 hours or be fired.
And when they defied his order, he fired roughly 12,000 of them.
He did. He used military controllers to manage air traffic. This action was highly symbolic. It profoundly demoralized organized labor, and you see a significant decline in strikes and union membership throughout the 1980s.
His record on civil rights is equally complex. While his administration was often criticized, he did, for instance, sign the 25-year extension of the Voting Rights Act in 1982, which he had previously opposed.
Similarly, there was strong opposition from his administration to creating Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but he signed the bill creating the federal holiday in 1983 after it passed with veto-proof margins.
However, his administration consistently opposed affirmative action, viewing it as a form of reverse discrimination. And the sources note his administration saw considerably fewer fair housing cases filed than his predecessors.
A later example is the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1987. Reagan vetoed the bill, arguing it improperly expanded federal power. That veto was swiftly overridden by Congress, underscoring the ongoing battle over civil rights enforcement.
This political climate sets the stage for the second term, which was overwhelmingly dominated by foreign affairs, escalating the Cold War, and navigating a major scandal.
From the outset, Reagan radically changed U.S. foreign policy. He moved decisively away from containment and détente, adopting what became known as the Reagan Doctrine.
So help us define the Reagan Doctrine more fully. What was its ambition?
Its ambition was explicitly to defeat the Soviet Union, not just contain it. The doctrine committed the U.S. to supporting anti-communist movements globally, like the Afghan Mujahideen or the anti-Sandinista Contras in Nicaragua.
And his rhetoric mirrored this aggressive posture. In 1983, he famously dubbed the Soviet Union the evil empire.
He also declared that the march of freedom and democracy will leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history. These were not just empty words. They were backed by a significant military buildup.
One of the most controversial elements of this was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. This was a proposed system to defend the U.S. from ICBMs from space.
Opponents immediately dubbed it Star Wars, but it served a crucial geopolitical purpose. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov considered an extremely serious destabilizing development. Reagan understood that forcing the Soviets to compete in a high-tech arms race would be economically ruinous for them.
Before his second term began, he also demonstrated his willingness to use military force, ordering the invasion of Grenada in 1983.
He cited the regional threat of a Soviet-Cuban buildup and, critically, concern for about 600 American medical students there. The invasion was a military success and enjoyed great domestic support, despite being condemned internationally.
This strong posture, coupled with the economic recovery, set the stage for his 1984 re-election. His age was an issue, especially after a weaker performance in the first debate against Walter Mondale.
But that concern just dissipated entirely during the second debate, with one of the most memorable political moments of the decade. When pressed on his age, he delivered that famous, disarming quip.
"I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience."
That line immediately generated applause and laughter, even from Mondale himself. It effectively neutralized the issue. Reagan won in a massive landslide, securing 525 electoral votes.
But the celebratory tone was quickly overshadowed by one of the largest crises of his administration, the Iran-Contra affair.
Yes, which unfolded publicly in late '86. This affair involved a series of illegal actions centered on executive branch defiance of Congress. The illegal activity was twofold.
Involving the Contras in Nicaragua and hostages in Lebanon.
First, Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, which specifically barred the administration from providing military aid to the anti-communist Contras.
Second, the administration was desperate to secure the release of 7 American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. To do this, they secretly sold arms to Iran.
And the truly damaging part was the financial cover-up. The proceeds from those arms sales to Iran were secretly diverted and illegally funneled to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, completely circumventing the Boland Amendment.
The scheme was largely orchestrated by key White House staffers, most notably Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
When it was exposed, Reagan initially denied any knowledge. He eventually formed the Tower Commission to investigate, and its report was extraordinarily critical.
It confirmed the arms for hostages deal.
And it was scathing. It noted that while they couldn't find conclusive proof Reagan knew about the illegal diversion of funds, he had created the conditions which made possible the crimes committed by others, and had knowingly participated or acquiesced in covering up the scandal.
It severely damaged the administration's credibility and marked the lowest point of his presidency.
Despite that, foreign policy action continued. In 1986, he authorized airstrikes against Libya, citing irrefutable evidence of their role in the West Berlin discotheque bombing that killed an American soldier.
The action was justified as self-defense, but was condemned by the UN General Assembly.
Then, in 1987, the USS Stark incident occurred. An Iraqi fighter jet mistakenly hit the naval vessel, killing 37 sailors. Reagan accepted Iraq's apology, but his framing of the situation was revealing.
He immediately declared a policy of self-defense for U.S. ships and then pointed the finger at the other belligerent, declaring Iran to be the villain in the peace.
It ensured the focus remained on containing Iran. But amid all this conflict, a critical and historic shift was beginning with the Soviet Union, driven by the emergence of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Reagan recognized a change and shifted from brinkmanship to active diplomacy.
They held 4 summit conferences. The 1986 Reykjavik summit was incredibly important. They nearly brokered an agreement to abolish all nuclear weapons.
But the deal ultimately collapsed because Reagan refused Gorbachev's condition that SDI research be confined to labs.
Reagan vehemently insisted SDI was purely defensive and that he wouldn't give up the research. But the continued dialogue led to a major success in 1987 at the Washington summit,
where they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, a truly historic agreement.
It committed both nations to the total abolition of all their short and medium-range missile stockpiles. It was the first time an entire class of nuclear weapons was eliminated by mutual agreement, boosting Reagan's popularity significantly post-Iran-Contra.
And it was during this period, in June '87, that he delivered his most celebrated foreign policy speech at the Brandenburg Gate.
He stood before the wall, making his famous demand, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It's crucial to know that at the time, many considered the line unnecessary brinkmanship. But once the wall fell in 1989, that quote was retroactively cemented in history.
As we move toward his legacy, we have to address the complex social and public health crises of the decade, specifically the devastating AIDS epidemic.
And we must approach this with professionalism and sympathy for the affected communities. This failure of response remains one of the most heavily criticized aspects of his administration.
The epidemic began to emerge in '81, and it was initially very difficult to understand the nature of the disease, which disproportionately affected gay men, injection drug users, and hemophiliacs.
The sources reveal a profound initial lack of urgency in the White House. There are reports that Reagan himself initially dismissed the threat, thinking of AIDS as though it was the measles and would go away.
The death of his friend Rock Hudson in late 1985 seemed to be a turning point, but Reagan himself did not mention AIDS publicly for months afterward.
His first major public speech on the epidemic wasn't until 1987. By that time, 36,058 Americans had been diagnosed, and over 20,000 had tragically died.
Critics focus on the slow, muted response and what they considered chronic underfunding for research in the early years.
The political context matters here. The disease was initially stigmatized as a gay plague. While the administration proposed $2.8 billion for AIDS spending from '84 to '89, pressure from congressional Democrats ultimately raised the total federal spending to $5.6 billion, demonstrating the ongoing conflict over prioritizing the crisis.
Relatedly, the administration intensified the war on drugs in 1982 in response to the crack cocaine epidemic.
The Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of '86 and '88 specified harsh mandatory minimum penalties. This included Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. These acts have since been highly criticized for creating significant racial disparities in sentencing.
On the international human rights front, his administration implemented the controversial policy of constructive engagement with South Africa's apartheid regime.
The idea was that dialogue, not isolation, would encourage reforms. Reagan opposed sanctions, arguing they would hurt black employees and remove U.S. leverage.
This stance drew incredibly sharp criticism. Desmond Tutu famously called Reagan's administration an unmitigated disaster for us blacks, and Reagan himself a racist pure and simple.
The political will eventually overwhelmed him. Congress overrode Reagan's veto of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986, imposing much tougher sanctions.
After leaving the presidency, he maintained a public presence, notably breaking with hardline conservatives on gun control.
This is a crucial detail. Following the Stockton schoolyard shooting, he publicly supported the Brady Bill. He argued that military-style weapons like the AK-47 were not a sporting weapon or needed for the defense of the home.
His post-presidency was tragically defined by his declining health. In August 1994, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which he announced to the nation in a handwritten letter.
The diagnosis led to speculation about when it began, but his personal doctors maintained that overt clinical symptoms most likely began in late '92 or '93, years after he left office. The disease gradually took its toll. By the end of 2003, he had lost the ability to speak. He died in June 2004.
Looking back, his historical reputation remains consistently high. He is usually ranked in the middle to upper tier of U.S. presidents, and many scholars consider him the most influential president since FDR.
The consensus credits him with two major achievements. First, successfully rehabilitating conservatism and shifting the country rightward. Second, playing a significant part in the end of the Cold War through military buildup and eventual negotiations with Gorbachev.
The historian Melvin P. Leffler called him Gorbachev's minor yet indispensable partner.
His enduring political influence is immense. He cemented conservatism as the dominant ideology in the Republican Party.
He also earned two defining nicknames that perfectly encapsulate his appeal. First, the Great Communicator,
for his ability to explain complex issues clearly, and second, the Teflon president, because major controversies like Iran-Contra seem to fail to tarnish his public image.
Yet the contrarian view is also strongly represented, particularly on economic outcomes. Critics cite his tenure as the start of the Great Divergence, a period of sharply increased income inequality.
Others criticize what they view as severe fiscal irresponsibility, pointing to the massive deficits that created a structural fiscal burden for future generations.
If we consider the sweep of his life, from the boy practicing radio calls from wire reports to the politician who redefined American priorities, the central, stark irony of his entire career is tied precisely to his greatest public strength.
He was celebrated universally as the Great Communicator, revered for his command of language and narrative.
But the sources remind us that Ronald Reagan spent the final decade of his life afflicted by Alzheimer's, a cruel disease that gradually stole the very mental capacity to speak or recognize his family. The contrast is profound.
And this contrast raises an important question for you, the learner, to consider as you reflect on his legacy. Does a public figure's celebrated ability to craft a powerful political narrative and communicate an optimistic vision ultimately outweigh the physical and sometimes fiscal realities they leave behind?
That's a crucial question to ponder, weighing the lasting ideological impact against the concrete outcomes of his tenure.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening.